Welcome, future clinicians, to this explainer on female sexual dysfunction. Today, we're going to treat this session just like a rigorous medical school lecture. We are breaking down outdated terminology, we'll challenge those common misconceptions, and establish a really clear, evidence-based approach to patient care. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right in. Now, before we get too deep, a quick but absolutely mandatory ethics reminder. This explainer is purely for educational purposes. It's not medical advice, it's not a diagnosis, and it's definitely not treatment. You know the drill, this shouldn't ever replace individualized professional evaluation or dictate medication changes. If a patient is experiencing persistent or distressing changes, they need to consult a qualified medical professional. All right, here's our syllabus for today. 1. Disclaimer and medical definitions. 2. Symptoms and clinical presentation. 3. Etiology and contributing factors. 4. Diagnostic evaluation framework. 5. Comprehensive treatment approaches. And 6. Myths and practical framework. Section 1. Disclaimer and medical definitions. Consider how medicine has thankfully evolved regarding female sexual health. We are finally shifting away from that highly stigmatizing, totally non-medical label of frigidity. Historically, this term was just thrown around as a catch-all for any woman showing low sexual desire. But modern medical practice, including guidance from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, recognizes this is just medically imprecise. Instead, we use precise domain-specific diagnoses. Terms like female sexual dysfunction or female sexual interest/arousal disorder. Why? Because these terms actually describe what's biologically and psychologically happening with the patient. So, female sexuality is incredibly complex. It's not controlled by a single organ or some magic sex drive center in the brain. It's actually a web of overlapping domains. We're talking baseline desire, physical arousal, genital response, orgasm, emotional comfort, and, this is huge, the absolute absence of pain. Describing all of these unique difficulties as just frigidity completely masks the real medical data. Think about it. A patient could have totally normal desire but experience severe pain, or have physical arousal but literally zero subjective pleasure. As clinicians, you have to evaluate each specific domain individually. Here's a crucial takeaway. Low desire is not automatically a disorder. Sexual desire naturally ebbs and flows, right? For a clinical female sexual interest/arousal disorder diagnosis, aligned with modern diagnostic frameworks, we're looking for a specific combo of clinical features. Things like reduced thoughts, lowered initiation, or reduced genital sensations. But, and this is the absolute key for your clinical practice, these symptoms must persist for about 6 months, and, most importantly, they have to cause the patient clinically significant distress. Honestly, if she has low desire but isn't bothered by it, it simply isn't a disorder. Section 2. Symptoms and clinical presentation. So what does this actually look like in your clinic? Well, patients might present with any combination of these 6 major symptoms. They might rarely think about intimacy, or they might really desire it but find their body just doesn't respond with adequate lubrication. Some really struggle with reaching orgasm, while others experience sharp, undeniable pain before, during, or after penetration. And pay attention to this. Physical pain almost always triggers a profound psychological cycle of avoidance. Makes sense, right? If sex hurts, the brain instantly associates it with fear, which leads to actively avoiding intimacy altogether. Section 3. Etiology and contributing factors. When trying to find the root cause, there are 12 primary etiological categories you need to consider. As top clinical institutions always emphasize, female sexual dysfunction is deeply multifactorial. You're constantly balancing biological markers, like declining estrogen during menopause, thyroid disorders, or the notorious side effects of SSRI antidepressants, against psychosocial factors. We're talking profound postpartum exhaustion, untreated anxiety, relationship stress, or even a history of trauma. It's almost never just one isolated physical or mental cause. It's this complex, tangled web of both. Okay, this is a vital concept and one you absolutely must educate your patients on: the difference between spontaneous and responsive desire. There is this massive cultural myth that healthy sexual desire has to just spontaneously appear out of nowhere, like a lightning bolt. In reality, so many women naturally experience responsive desire. That means the desire only develops after affection, intimacy, or stimulation has already started. This is 100% normal physiology, guys. It is absolutely not a pathology. Section 4. Diagnostic Evaluation Framework. All right, how do we actually diagnose this systematically? Your workup is going to rely heavily on a detailed, highly compassionate clinical conversation. You need to explore the onset, the context, and those distress levels. A targeted pelvic exam is absolutely critical to identify physical barriers. Think vaginal dryness, thinning tissues typical of genitourinary syndrome of menopause, or pelvic floor pain. You'll also run individualized blood tests for things like thyroid function or diabetes, entirely based on their specific symptoms. But grab your pens and write this down. Despite what the internet tries to sell your patients, there is literally no such thing as a universal female libido blood test. Indiscriminate hormone testing is definitely not the standard of care. Patients are often way too embarrassed to bring this stuff up, so it's on you to empower them. Encourage your patients to ask specific, probing questions. When they ask, hey, could my blood pressure meds or antidepressants be doing this? Or is this menopausal vaginal dryness tanking my baseline desire? They are actively helping you uncover the root causes. It totally flips the script, turning a really vulnerable, stigmatized topic into an objective, collaborative medical investigation. Section 5. Comprehensive treatment approaches. Because the etiologies are so varied, our management strategies have to be highly individualized. First-line treatments typically combine psychoeducation and targeted therapy with immediate physical relief. You simply have to treat the mind and the body simultaneously. For instance, you might refer a patient for cognitive behavioral therapy or couples counseling to fix some emotional distance. But at the exact same time, if she's suffering from genitourinary syndrome of menopause, prescribing local vaginal estrogen or suggesting the right lubricants can literally instantly resolve the physical pain that was driving her avoidance cycle in the first place. Now, what about pharmacological interventions? Strict clinical supervision is non-negotiable here. Medications like flibanserin and bremelanotide do exist, but they're really only for highly specific populations dealing with acquired, generalized low desire. Systemic testosterone therapy, that requires extremely strict adherence to specialized clinical guidelines for careful patient selection and monitoring. And please, you've got to actively warn your patients against those unregulated, over-the-counter herbal libido boosters. They totally lack robust safety and efficacy data. Section 6. Myths and Practical Framework. Let's bring it all together by busting some widespread clinical myths. As medical professionals, you have to actively debunk these 6 common myths to provide real, judgment-free care. It is not always low hormones, just like it isn't all in her head. In menopause, it absolutely does not mean the end of a woman's sex life. It just introduces some physical changes that require targeted medical care. Finally, because this dysfunction is so wonderfully complex and heterogeneous, there is no magic single pill that cures everything. Okay, time to memorize these 5 steps. This multidimensional framework will guide you through literally every single clinical encounter regarding sexual dysfunction. Step 1, narrow down the exact problem or domain. Step 2, establish the timeline. When did this begin? Step 3, figure out if it's generalized or situational. Step 4, verify the presence of clinically significant distress. And Step 5, assess the holistic equation. That's body plus brain plus hormones plus medications plus relationships. Seriously, take a second to lock that in. This is exactly how you practice modern sexual medicine. And we can't forget to address the interpersonal dynamics in the room. The World Health Organization explicitly states that sexual health requires safe experiences that are completely free from coercion. You need to remind partners not to take these medical symptoms as some kind of deliberate personal rejection. A supportive partner, one who actively listens, respects boundaries, and avoids pressure, is an absolutely crucial piece of the patient's overall treatment and recovery plan. If there's one ultimate takeaway you impart to your patients, let it be this. These difficulties are real, valid, and incredibly widespread medical conditions, and they are treatable. Seeking care for a distressing sexual problem is a totally legitimate, shame-free healthcare decision. Honestly, it's just as important as managing blood pressure or treating diabetes. So I'll leave you with this final thought to carry into your practice. How are you going to reframe your clinical perspective? We have to permanently abandon those outdated, stigmatizing labels. Your real job is to look at the whole patient. Identify exactly what aspect of her physiology or psychology has shifted, uncover those contributing factors, and compassionately ask if she wants your help. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking the right questions, and I'll catch you next time.